The reading this morning is a little unusual for a UU church. It's from Dante's Inferno, where Dante, the poet, conducted by his guide Virgil, has made it to the fourth circle of hell. It's Canto 7. In that way we descended into the fourth circle, taking in a greater width of the dismal bank that encloses every evil in the universe. O divine justice, who can tell the many new pains and troubles that I saw, and why our guilt so destroys us? As the wave of a Charybdis strikes against the wave it counters, so the people here are made to dance. Made to dance. Think about that. I found more people here than elsewhere, on the one side and on the other, rolling weights by pushing with their chests with loud howling. They struck against each other and then each wheeled around where they were, rolling the reverse way, shouting, "Why do you hold? And why do you throw away? Why do you hold? And why do you throw away?" So they returned along the gloomy circle from either side to the opposite point, shouting again their measure of reproach. Then each one, when he had reached it, wheeled through his half circle onto the other track. And I, who felt as if my heart were pierced, said, "Master, show me now who these people are, and whether all these with tonsures on our left were churchmen." Tonsures is a way of wearing your hair that was peculiar to monks. And he to me, they were so twisted in mind in their first life that they made no balanced expenditure. Their voices bark this out most clearly when they come to the two ends of the circle, where opposing sins divide them. These were priests that are without hair on their heads, and popes and cardinals, in whom avarice does its worst. And I, "Master, surely amongst this crowd I ought to recognize some of those tainted with these evils." And he to me, "You link idle thoughts, the life without knowledge that made them ignoble, now makes them incapable of being known. They will go butting each other to eternity, and these will rise from their graves with grasping fists, and those with shorn hair. Useless giving and useless keeping has robbed them of the bright world and set them to this struggle. What struggle it is, I do not amplify. But you, my son, can see now the vain mockery of the wealth controlled by fortune, for which the human race fight with each other, since all the gold under the moon that ever was could not give peace to one of these weary souls. Spring cleaning, what a beautiful sight greets us in this sanctuary this morning. We had our annual cleaning day yesterday, and about a dozen of us came and scoured this old place and made it sparkle. Doesn't it look great? Let's have a round of appreciation for all those who made this happen, particularly for Dolly Howard, who organized. But it raises the question, why does spring bring out this urge to clean up, to reorganize, to throw out? And how do we do it? Maybe for some of you it is routine, but for me it's a challenge. I have not made a place for everything, nor is everything in its place by a long shot. About my house and my office, things tend to live wherever I plop them down, and this is not usually where they're supposed to be if I'm able to find them later. I'm ashamed to say, a messy rabbit. When I first started to practice law, one of the first lessons I learned was the vital importance of keeping your case files in order. Every paper related to a particular case had to be in that case file, or you wouldn't be representing the client well. You might think this would mean that every file was kept in its drawer and my desk would be always clean. Nope. The desk was always awash in papers that had come out of files I was soon about to make it into files. I remember vividly the time I considered the low point of my law practice. A person came to see me in my office after she had just gotten divorce papers from her husband, who lived in California. I'm practicing in Charleston, South Carolina. She had only 20 days to respond to them. I told her I would look into it, but I couldn't get around to it for a couple of days. A couple of days later, with the deadline looming for response to the suit, the paper she brought me had disappeared. I had no way of knowing the county in which the case had been filed or the name of the opposing counsel. Suddenly, the specter of malpractice loomed. I had to find that paper. After turning over my office, I went behind the building and retrieved the large garbage cans for the whole building. I brought them up to an open space in the dead files room and dumped them out on the floor. And there, under some coffee grounds, behind the banana peels, above the ashtray residue, I found the missing papers. Disaster averted, but I will always remember that paper chase. When computers came along, they were a godsend because you could create your own filing system on the computer. And if you didn't remember how you would file something, you could always find any bit of information by doing a search for a word in the entire hard drive of the computer. Later on, you could do this on the internet. So now we keep a lot of our information digitally. That means there aren't any books or papers on our desks, right? Wrong. Through all the technological revolutions of my life, my basic messiness level hasn't changed much. I will go through a spasm of cleaning, maybe in the spring, and then lapse back into my comfortable squalor. I'm sure this is not most of you. I'm sure that most of you are better housekeepers than I. But then, these things are relative. I remember sometime in the mid-1980s, when I lived in downtown Charleston, there had been a family of 4 next door to us for the first 5 or 6 years we lived in our house, and then they sold to a gay male couple. My first wife, Lee, and I socialized with both of these sets of neighbors, and that house was always pin neat when we went there, whichever the owner. A few months after the house changed owners, one of my new neighbors was discussing the condition of the house when they moved in and said, well, it appears that Anne never cleaned under the refrigerator. We all nodded as if in agreement that this was indeed horrendous. But what Lee and I were thinking was, clean under the refrigerator? You're going to move the refrigerator to clean the floor under? So it's all relative to one's standards for neatness. And I know I'm resistant to cleaning and organizing in part because I'm lazy. But there is another, deeper component. Amidst all the clutter, I fear that I'll find a reminder of some piece of business I should have taken care of months ago. In some, spring cleaning does have a strong spiritual aspect. Some of us dread it. Others genuinely enjoy, really get into the tasks, and still others of us will try to trick ourselves into enjoying it. One technique is to envision the beautiful house you want to end up with. If you can keep that vision in your mind, it might motivate you to the task. Remember Heracles from Greek mythology, or Hercules in Latin. He had a series of impossible tasks, one of which was to clean out the Augean stables. Now, Augeas was a rich man, king of Elis, and he had over 1,000 head of cattle, and his stables had never been cleaned out. On top of that, the livestock were immortal, and each produced enormous quantities of you-know-what. You can imagine the sight. You can imagine the smell. Heracles' task was to clean out the stables in one day. He solved the problem by diverting 2 rivers, the Apheus and the Peneus, through the stables to wash out the filth. People like me who have trouble actually picking up the mop and getting started will dream of a nice global solution like Heracles found. I will warn you, though, that while it might work for the waste of immortal cattle, river water is probably not good for your electronic equipment or your stashes of unread magazines. A line comes back to me from the devotions of my childhood. Open wide the windows of my soul. This, it seems to me, is the best expression of the spiritual component of spring cleaning. What we want to be about is opening our eyes, seeing things in a new light. Spring has given us a whole new world out there. And there's a whole world in here, as we explored last week in our meditation session. We do spring cleaning because spring is inherently messy. The orderliness, the spareness of the winter landscape, particularly the snowscape, gives way to the swirling variety of the springscape. It used to be called mud time, and some of us have a mud room in our houses, which is where some of the clutter tends to congregate. The theory is the mud gets confined to the one room and does not spread over the newly vacuumed carpet in the living room. Now, one of the rewards of spring cleaning is that you sometimes retrieve valuable things. In all that clutter, there's sometimes some history that gives you some perspective on life today. I remember poking around in the basement of a previous church I served and finding a mimeograph machine. And all of a sudden I was awash in memories of how central those things used to be in churches and schools. Who can forget the smell of the liquid they used? And there came a time when the Xerox machine just moved in, and within a year or two, everyone who used mimeograph machines switched over to copiers, and most people threw out their mimeos, except for the churches. Churches don't throw things away because we all understand that what is one person's trash is another person's treasure. Yesterday, Janice Bianculi and I were cleaning out the little room in the annex where we want to set up the loom. We had a collection of boxes from an old photo exhibit. The exhibit, of course, was part of our history, and the people who assembled it are still here, and so we didn't feel we could or should throw it out, but we found another place to store it. That was a pretty easy decision. But then in the same room, there was a storage area under a window bench which had a lot of old wires and old magazines and looked as if it hadn't been touched in a decade or more. We elected to toss them, but we understood that the decision ran the risk of having someone come in later and say they were saving those old wires and magazines for some project. Some of you may remember the Universalist windows. The old colored glass windows with the Gothic arch at the top, which had been in the building at what is now St. Crispus Episcopal Church, the building which had started its life as the Universalist Church of Chatham. Because we were the spiritual successors, in a sense, to the old Universalists, St. Christopher's offered them to us. We debated for months what to do with them. Feelings ran high, and an annual meeting, the vote against displaying them won out narrowly. But there was a kind of a bad feeling that the people who wanted to display them didn't get their way, so Gene Pickett proposed another motion, that we keep them in storage. And that passed by a large margin. And so they sit in the loft, year after year, a prisoner to our collective indecision. Maybe some future generations will discover them and wonder what happened. And if they're ignorant of the true story, they would have no qualms about hauling them off to the transfer station because time is not making them any prettier, and they aren't very pretty to begin with. They're colored glass windows. The pretty stained glass windows from the Chatham Universalist Church or elsewhere. Certainly one in the Atwood House, and I think one in the Impudent Oyster. Trash and treasure are judgments of our minds, and different people will reach different conclusions. While I was storing the photo exhibit in the room up there, I had to move a couple of boards, and I happened to look at them and discovered they had writing on them. Here they are. shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. That's from the Gospel of John. Divine love always has met and always will meet everyday human need. Mary Baker Eddy. These are from the earlier life of this building, when it was a Christian Science church. I gather these quotations are two of the central tenets of that religion. The reason I think that is that these two quotations were also on the walls of this sanctuary, and in fact are still on the walls. For this salmon-colored paint that our UU forefathers and mothers applied to these walls almost 20 years ago was not dense enough to completely cover the gold leaf lettering, and at the right angle of the sun and your eye, you can still see this lettering in the spaces above the side doors. Well, you can delight in this type of discovery, or you can just say, well, that's interesting, and move on. What we're seriously about in spring cleaning in the church is making our home bright and welcoming for us all and for anyone who may visit. That's the point. It improves our state of mind and shows that we care about our physical surroundings. I talked last week about mindfulness meditation and the way it shows you how your mind works. The mind is not a well-oiled computer processing input and turning it into output in a linear fashion. No, when you meditate, you become aware that the mind is a bubbling cauldron, a stew pot of ideas, words, feelings, and memories. The mind is messy, and the messiness within the mind mirrors the messiness we see outside in the world. And that is one of the great satisfactions of spring cleaning. You can tame a bit of the messiness in your mind by meditation and other mindfulness techniques, but basically you learn to live with it. But you can do something about the messiness in the world you inhabit. You can take arms against a sea of disorder, roll up your sleeves, and attack. This, of course, requires doing. I talked last week about the virtue of non-doing, of doing nothing. That is one mode. And if we do nothing about cleaning the world around us, we know that clutter, dust, and mold will simply accumulate. As our great Unitarian poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow reminds us, let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. There's a time for laboring and a time for waiting, a time for doing and a time for non-doing. The world around you, in your house and church, is cleanable in a way that your mind is not. As most of you know, I am addicted to crosswords. And part of the reason is that crosswords are questions with a right answer. So many of the questions we deal with in life have no right answer, or more than one right answer. Or the answer we give today will be different from the answer we gave 20 years ago. The crossword puzzle is the product of one mind, and that mind has started by constructing a grid of words and then constructing a series of clues to these words in order to delight the solver with the cleverness of the solution. The solutions to the larger problems in life, poverty, war, racism, are not nearly so clear-cut. If there's one mind which created these problems, it is one that is subtle and not at all consistent. Worse than that, sometimes the solutions we enact actually create new problems of their own. I've always been drawn to the scheme proposed by the philosopher George Friedrich Hegel back in the 19th century for the way that ideas develop. An idea pops up and people start talking about it. Some people adopt it, others say that's not right and develop the opposite idea. So the original idea is called a thesis, and the contrary idea becomes an antithesis, the antithesis. Thesis and antithesis contend with each other until they resolve in a third idea, which is called a synthesis. The synthesis then generates its own opposite, its its own antithesis, and the process repeats itself. Hegel was talking about this in the realm of ideas, but in the next generation, Marx used this scheme to talk about the forces of history. How did we get on Hegel and Marx? We were talking about spring cleaning. So all of that is really a long way of saying that if we think that our homes and churches and offices are messy, they are not nearly as messy as the larger reality in which they are situated, nor as messy as the space in here where we have to think about them. So my take home this morning is that the great attraction of cleaning up our homes or offices or cars or churches is that it is actually much simpler than cleaning up the clutter in the larger world or the disorder in our own minds. Open wide the windows of my soul, that I may see good in all things. There is good and bad to be seen, my friends. Let's try to remember to see the good. Thank you to all who helped with the spring cleaning of the church yesterday. And may we all find the courage, patience, and time to tackle a little in the other places we inhabit. 3 years ago, I wrote a little hymn of praise to spring cleaning, and I will leave you with that. Are singing, the buds are a-bursting, spring is unfolding, its colors pastel, daffodils blooming, and bees are out buzzing, bunnies are hopping right down in the dell, but inside my house the chaos is swirling with musty reminders wherever I roam. The dust bunnies caucus right under the sofa. Alas, grow the cooties alive in my home. In every small cranny, there's months worth of junk mail and articles I've been intending to read. Old shower curtains pile up in the basement, atop all the other stuff I don't need. It's time to take arms against the sea of detritus. It's time to wade in with trash bags and mop. I'll save all the good stuff to take to the thrift shop. A Cowtown transfer station will be my last stop.